The fog rolled in thick from the sea as I stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring out into the vast, gray expanse of water that had once brought so much life to this town. Now it seemed like a graveyard, with the waves crashing against the rocks below, their rhythm slow and heavy, as if mourning something long lost. The air was damp with salt, clinging to my skin, and even though I hadn't been back in years, the scent felt hauntingly familiar. The house stood just behind me, our family home, its whitewashed walls now peeling, the once vibrant roof sagging under the weight of neglect. It had always felt small when I was a boy, too cramped with memories of my father's stern face, my mother's quiet sighs, and the lingering tension between my sister, Maeve, and me. But now, after so many years away, it felt vast, hollow even, as if every room echoed with ghosts. I had returned here after what felt like a lifetime away, yet nothing had truly changed. The town, isolated on this stretch of the Irish coast, was as insular as ever. People were still secretive, speaking in hushed tones about things that never seemed to reach the surface. When I left for Dublin years ago, I thought I would never return. I imagined I could escape the suffocating smallness of it all. But after losing Aoife, after watching the life drain from her so suddenly, I needed distance from that pain. And yet, somehow, this old, weather-beaten house had called me back. It wasn't peace I sought. Peace was a distant concept now, something others could speak of, but I no longer felt. What I sought was something else, perhaps just an escape from the constant gnawing ache in my chest. The ocean's roar filled the empty space inside me, drowning out the silence of my own thoughts, if only for a moment. I stepped closer to the edge of the cliff, watching as the waves surged and fell, and for a fleeting moment, I considered letting them pull me in. Just letting the water take me. It would be easy. I could almost feel it, the icy grip of the sea, the sensation of being swallowed by something so much larger than myself. But then a voice from the past echoed in my mind, bringing me back. My father's voice, stern, sharp, telling me to stand strong. "You're Callahan," he used to say. "We stand our ground." I took a step back from the edge, my chest tightening. It wasn't time to give up just yet. Not when I had only just arrived. I turned toward the house, the wind whipping at my jacket, and made my way inside. The door creaked as I opened it, the sound too loud in the otherwise still air. Inside, everything was just as I remembered. The old wooden floors groaned underfoot, and the walls were lined with the same faded pictures of my ancestors, their eyes seeming to watch me as I moved through the entryway. My father's chair sat untouched by the fireplace, a blanket draped over its back as if waiting for him to return. But he wouldn't return. Neither would Aoife. And that left me here alone in a house filled with memories I didn't know how to escape. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. My old room was as I had left it, a bed with a threadbare quilt, a small desk by the window, and the scent of the sea still lingering in the air. I dropped my bag onto the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, running my hands through my hair, trying to shake the heaviness that clung to me like the fog outside. Outside, the wind howled louder, and as I glanced out the window, I thought I saw a figure standing by the cliffs. A shadow, just barely visible through the mist, unmoving. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was gone. I exhaled slowly, shaking off the unsettling feeling that had crept into my chest. It was just the fog, playing tricks on my tired mind. I'd been traveling too long, lost too much. I needed rest. Lying back on the bed, I let the sound of the waves and wind lull me into a restless sleep. But even in my dreams, I couldn't escape the sense that something was watching me. Something I couldn't yet see, but knew was there, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The night was thick with shadows when I woke up. The wind had died down, leaving the air eerily still. Only the steady sound of waves crashing against the cliffs reached my ears. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of silence. But as I looked around the room, the memories of the day came rushing back. I was home, though the word felt hollow in my mind. Rubbing my eyes, I sat up and glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. Outside, the fog still clung to the landscape, impenetrable and suffocating. I should have felt comfort in the quiet, but there was a nagging sense of unease that refused to let me relax. I stood and moved toward the window, hoping the cool air would help clear my head. But as I opened it, instead of a fresh breeze, the scent of the sea seemed heavier, more pungent, like rotting seaweed carried on the wind. And then, from somewhere deep within the fog, came the sound. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic splashing, as if something was moving through the water. I leaned out the window, trying to locate the source, but the mist was too thick to see anything beyond the edges of the cliffs. The splashing grew louder, more deliberate. This wasn't the random sound of waves hitting rocks. No, it was something else, something alive. I strained my ears, holding my breath, listening. And then I heard it, a soft humming. The voice was low, melodic, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent of sorrow in the tone. The melody twisted through the fog, wrapping around me like a cold embrace, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart began to race, though I couldn't explain why. I leaned further out, squinting into the darkness, trying to catch sight of whoever or whatever was out there. The splashing stopped abruptly, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse. Then, the humming stopped as well, replaced by silence so absolute that it pressed against my ears, making me feel lightheaded. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the open window, snapping me out of my trance. I pulled back and shut the window quickly, my hands trembling. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a fisherman out late on the water, or maybe one of the villagers passing through. But deep down, I knew neither explanation fit. I retreated to the bed, my pulse still racing, and tried to calm myself. "It's just the wind," I muttered under my breath. Just the wind playing tricks. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. My eyes kept darting toward the window, half expecting to see something watching me from outside, hidden in the fog. The hours crept by slowly. Sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear the splashing again, the melody drifting through my mind like a distant echo. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me after such a long journey and so much loss. But no matter how hard I tried, the sense of unease lingered. Just as the first light of dawn began to break through the fog, I heard it again, this time closer. A wet, heavy thud against the wooden steps outside the house. Then another. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder until it reached the door. There was a pause, and I waited, every muscle in my body tense. I couldn't move, couldn't think. And then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the door. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky as I crossed the room. Every step felt like an eternity. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over the handle for a moment, paralyzed by fear. Finally, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. There was nothing there. Just the mist swirling around the front steps and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. I looked down and saw them, wet footprints leading away from the door and disappearing into the fog. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling, and backed away. My heart pounded in my chest as I locked the door and pressed my back against it, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The house was silent once more, but the echoes of the knocking and the sight of those footprints haunted me as the morning light crept in. The day brought no relief. The fog, still clinging to the cliffs like an old blanket, gave the morning a dull, lifeless feel. Even the sun seemed unwilling to penetrate the gloom. I barely slept after the knocking at the door, and though I tried to shake off the fear from the night, it lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me like a pestilent whisper. I couldn't stay locked away in the house all day, haunted by questions and strange noises. I needed answers, and I knew Maeve was the only one who might help me make sense of what was happening. So, despite our history and the years of estrangement, I made my way into town to see her. The walk through the narrow, cobbled streets of the village felt strange, like slipping into an old, ill-fitting coat. The townspeople kept to themselves, though their eyes followed me as I passed. They knew who I was. They always knew. Even though I had been gone for years, I was still a Callahan, and that meant something here, though what, exactly, was often hard to tell. Maeve's cottage sat just on the outskirts of town, a quaint place with a small garden out front, though most of it had long since gone to weeds. The paint on the walls was peeling, much like our family home, and the roof sagged as if the weight of years had taken its toll. I knocked, my hands still trembling slightly from the memory of the night before. Maeve answered the door, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Her eyes were tired, the lines of worry etched deep into her face. She looked older than I remembered, and though she smiled when she saw me, there was a tension behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Aiden," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of burning peat and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The house was dimly lit, and the familiar weight of old memories settled over me as I took in the small sitting room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with trinkets and books, many of which I recognized from our childhood. "I didn't think I'd be back either," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We sat in silence for a moment, neither of us willing to bridge the years of distance that had grown between us. Finally, Maeve spoke, her voice low and careful. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I had. I hesitated, the memories of Aoife's death still raw, but I didn't want to talk about her, not now. "I needed a change," I said, though it felt like a half-truth. "And maybe I needed to be somewhere familiar." Maeve studied me for a moment, then nodded as if she understood more than I was saying. "This place holds onto people," she said softly. "Sometimes it's hard to leave it behind." I shifted uncomfortably, my mind still racing with the strange events of the night before. "Maeve," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "something happened last night. At the house." Her expression changed instantly, her gaze sharpened, and she leaned in closer. "What happened?" I told her about the splashing, the humming, the knock at the door, and the wet footprints. As I spoke, I saw her face grow pale, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it all, chalk it up to my exhaustion or grief. But instead, she sat back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not imagining it," she said quietly. A shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Maeve stood and began pacing the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "There are things in this town, Aiden, things people don't talk about. But they're real. There are ghosts here, not just of people, but of events. They cling to the cliffs, to the sea, and to us." I felt my breath catch. "Maeve, what are you talking about?" She stopped and turned to face me. "It's Kieran, the man who drowned in the sea all those years ago. He's the one haunting you." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't heard it in years, not since I was a boy. Kieran had been a local fisherman, a quiet man who kept to himself. He had disappeared one stormy night, and though the townspeople had searched for him, they only found his body washed up on the shore a few days later. "You think Kieran is haunting me?" I asked, incredulous. "I don't think," Maeve said, her voice steady. "I know. His death, it wasn't an accident." I stared at her, stunned. "What are you saying? What happened?" Maeve's eyes darkened, and she lowered her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "There's more to Kieran's death than anyone knows. And our family, we were involved." The weight of her words settled over me, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. The room seemed to grow colder, and suddenly the fog outside the windows didn't feel so far away. It pressed in, threatening to suffocate me with the secrets it held. "What do you mean, involved?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Maeve hesitated, glancing out the window before speaking. "Our father, he knew more about Kieran's death than he ever let on. And whatever happened that night, it's not over. Kieran's spirit is tied to this place. And now, it's tied to you." The weight of Maeve's words hung between us like the fog outside, thick and unrelenting. I couldn't fully process what she had said, my mind stumbling over the implications. My family, tied to the death of a man whose ghost now haunted me. It was absurd. And yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. I left her cottage feeling numb, the echoes of our conversation swirling in my head. As I walked back through the village, The air felt colder, sharper, as if the town itself was reacting to the secrets that had surfaced. The narrow streets seemed narrower now, the cottages darker, the eyes of the townspeople more suspicious. I hurried home, eager to be away from their knowing stares. That night, the fog returned with a vengeance, thicker than ever before. The house felt more isolated, more suffocating, as if the fog had seeped into the very walls. I locked every door and window, though it did little to ease my nerves. The strange events from the night before played over and over in my mind. The splashing, the humming, the footprints, and now, with the knowledge that Kieran's death was more than a tragic accident, the fear gnawed at me with more intensity. I sat by the fire, trying to calm myself, but the flames couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Every creak of the old house set my heart racing. Every gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was letting Maeve's words get to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was here. Hours passed, and just when I began to think I could find some semblance of peace, the sounds started again. At first, it was just the wind, howling through the cracks in the windows. But soon, the wind was joined by something else, a faint, almost imperceptible humming. The same low, melodic sound I had heard the night before. I sat up straighter, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from outside, drifting through the fog like a ghostly lullaby. I forced myself to stand and approach the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the swirling mist, thick and impenetrable. But then, through the haze, I saw him. A figure standing by the cliffs. His silhouette was barely visible, but I could make out the outline of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his head slightly bowed. He was standing still, unmoving, as if waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat. Kieran. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I should have run. I should have slammed the window shut and locked myself inside. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure in the fog. He was watching me. I could feel his gaze, even though I couldn't see his face. And then, slowly, he began to move. At first, his steps were slow, deliberate, as if testing the ground beneath him. But soon, his pace quickened, his form becoming more distinct as he drew closer to the house. The closer he got, the more clearly I could hear the humming. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a voice, low and mournful, carrying with it the weight of the sea. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The air in the room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. The fire that had been burning so brightly only moments ago was now dim, the flames flickering weakly. I turned away from the window, trying to steady my breathing. But before I could gather my thoughts, a loud crash echoed through the house. It came from the front door. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that it sent a jolt of fear through me. I rushed to the door, my heart in my throat, and pressed my ear against the wood. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, another crash, louder this time, as if something heavy had been thrown against the door. I stepped back, my mind racing. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and held it tightly in my trembling hands. My breath came in shallow gasps as I waited, every muscle in my body tense, ready to fight if I had to. The third crash came, and the door shuddered in its frame. I expected it to give way, to splinter under the force of the blows. But instead, everything went quiet. The humming had stopped. The wind had died down. And for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came the voice. Low and raspy, it whispered through the keyhole like a breath of cold air. "I see you." My blood ran cold. The words echoed in the silence, chilling me to the core. I dropped the poker and stumbled back, my mind a blur of fear and disbelief. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, its walls closing in on me. I could still feel the presence outside, lingering just beyond the door, waiting. But I couldn't bring myself to move. All I could do was stand there, trembling in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. Morning came too slowly. I barely slept after the haunting voice whispered through the door. Those 3 words seared into my mind. I see you. The dawn brought little relief, only a dim, gray light that filtered through the fog, offering no warmth, no clarity. I lay on the bed for hours, my heart heavy with unease, waiting for some sense of normalcy to return. But it never did. By mid-morning, I finally forced myself out of bed and dressed. My hands shook as I laced up my boots, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The figure by the cliffs. The crashes at the door. The voice. Every part of me wanted to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But there was something stronger than fear pulling me deeper into this mystery. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by hiding inside this house. I headed back to Maeve's cottage, each step through the fog-filled streets feeling heavier than the last. My mind was still reeling from the strange occurrences, but now there was something else gnawing at me, the words Maeve had said about our father's involvement in Karen's death. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What could he have possibly done? And why had it been kept from me for so long? When I arrived at Maeve's door, I hesitated for a moment before knocking. The tension between us was palpable, and though I needed her help, part of me dreaded what she might reveal next. But I couldn't turn back now. Maeve opened the door, her face pale and drawn. She looked as though she hadn't slept either, her eyes shadowed with worry. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting me into the dim warmth of her cottage. We sat across from each other in the small sitting room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Maeve, I need you to tell me everything. No more secrets. What happened to Karen? What did our father have to do with it? Maeve's eyes flicked to the window, as if checking for unseen watchers before she spoke. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her voice quiet, almost as if she was afraid to speak the words aloud. It was years ago, she began, before you left for Dublin. I was still living at home, and you were just a boy. Kieran was one of the local fishermen, but he kept to himself. The town had its own way of dealing with outsiders, even those who had lived here their entire lives, but didn't quite fit in. I nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. This town had always been insular, its people suspicious of anyone who wasn't part of their tight-knit community. Karen, though born here, had never quite been one of them. One night, Maeve continued, there was a storm, one of the worst we'd had in years. Kieran went out on his boat, despite the warnings. He had debts to pay, and he couldn't afford to lose a day's catch. But he never came back. I leaned in closer, sensing that we were getting to the heart of it. What happened? The next day, they found his boat washed up on the shore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran wasn't on board. At first, they thought he had drowned, swept out to sea. But later that night, someone saw him alive. My heart skipped a beat. Alive? How? Maeve hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. No one knows. They found him down by the cliffs, soaking wet, half mad from the cold. He was rambling about something he had seen in the water, something he couldn't explain. My father, our father, was the one who found him. I frowned. What did he do? Maeve closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing herself for what came next. He brought Karen back to the house. But Karen was different. He wasn't just frightened, he was terrified. He kept saying that the sea had cursed him, that he'd seen something he shouldn't have. Something that wasn't meant for the living. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did father do? He didn't believe him, Maeve said, her voice cracking. He thought Karen was mad from the storm. He tried to calm him down, but Karen wouldn't stop. He kept saying that it was coming for him, that it wouldn't stop until he was dead. He was desperate, Aiden. He wasn't in his right mind. And then what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Maeve's eyes filled with tears. Father, he restrained him, tried to keep him from hurting himself. But in the struggle, Karen fell. He hit his head and died. The room seemed to close in around me as the weight of her words sank in. So it was an accident, I said, though the words felt hollow. Father didn't mean to kill him. Maeve shook her head. It doesn't matter. He covered it up. told the town that Karen had been lost at sea. He buried the truth, and with it, Karen's spirit was trapped here. That's why he's haunting you. He wants the truth to be known. I sat back, my mind spinning. Everything made sense now. The hauntings, the strange occurrences, the connection to my family. Karen wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking release. And I was the only one who could give it to him. The air was unnaturally still as I stood at the edge of the cliffs, waiting for midnight to arrive. The fog, though ever present, had retreated just enough to reveal the jagged rocks below, illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the clouds. The sea was calmer than it had been in days, the waves lapping gently against the shore as if resting before something greater stirred within them. I clutched the small, worn journal Father O'Malley had given me. Inside were the words I needed to speak, the truth that had been buried for so long. The truth that Karen's restless spirit had been waiting to hear. My breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale filling the cold air with a cloud of mist. Despite the stillness around me, there was a tension building in the atmosphere. It pressed down on me, growing heavier with each passing minute. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural, not until now. But standing there, with the cliffs beneath my feet and the weight of my father's sins on my shoulders, I knew there was something more than just wind and water in the air. The last moments of midnight crept closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drumbeat signaling the inevitable. I glanced down at the journal, the ink barely legible in the dim light, but I knew the words well enough by now. They were etched into my mind like a dark incantation, a burden I had no choice but to carry. I took a deep breath and looked out over the water. It was time. I opened the journal and began to speak. "Karen," I called, my voice trembling at first. "I know you are here. I know you've been waiting for this, waiting for someone to acknowledge the wrong done to you." The wind stirred, picking up slightly, tugging at my coat and hair. I could feel something shift in the air, a presence growing closer, though I could see nothing but the fog swirling around me. My father. I hesitated for a moment, the words catching in my throat, but I forced myself to continue. "My father wronged you. It wasn't your time to die. You were taken too soon, and the truth of what happened was hidden from the world." A sudden chill swept over me, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The air seemed to crackle with energy, a force I couldn't see but could feel deep in my bones. I knew Karen was listening. He was here. "You were a good man," I said, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. "And you didn't deserve to die the way you did. You were taken from this world unfairly, and for that, I ask your forgiveness on behalf of my family. I ask you to forgive my father for what happened that night." The wind howled in response, and the sea below seemed to surge with renewed strength, the waves crashing harder against the rocks. The fog thickened once more, curling around me like tendrils, obscuring everything except the words I spoke aloud. "I acknowledge your pain," I said, my voice carrying over the water. "I acknowledge your suffering, and I am sorry for what my family has done to you." I closed the journal, holding it tightly in my hands as I waited. For a moment, there was only silence, the world seeming to hold its breath along with me. Then, through the dense fog, I saw him. Karen. His form was faint at first, barely more than a shadow standing at the edge of the cliff opposite me. But as I watched, he became clearer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with soaked clothing and hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. His skin was pale, waterlogged, like a body pulled from the sea, but there was no malice in his gaze. Only sorrow. He stood there, watching me, his eyes full of a deep, unending sadness. I felt an overwhelming sense of loss wash over me, as if his grief were my own. My heart ached for him in that moment, for the life he had lost and the peace that had been denied him. "I see you," I whispered, echoing the words he had spoken through the door on that terrifying night. "I see you, Karen. And I release you." Karen's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. Then, slowly, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the mist like a wisp of smoke caught in the wind. The fog seemed to lift with him, thinning out as the tension in the air finally released. The weight that had pressed so heavily on my chest began to ease, replaced by a profound sense of calm. The sea, which had been so turbulent, now lapped gently at the shore, its power subdued. And just like that, Kieran was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been, feeling the night settle around me in a way that hadn't felt possible since I had returned. The ritual was done. The spirit was free. But as I turned to walk back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within me as well. I had faced the past and given voice to the truth that had been buried for so long. Yet, there was still an emptiness that lingered, a space where the secrets had once been, an emptiness that would take time to fill. I left Maeve's cottage feeling like I was walking through a nightmare. The truth of what had happened to Kieran weighed on me heavily, but it also gave me clarity. For the first time since I'd returned, I understood the reason for the haunting. It wasn't revenge. It was a plea for justice, for peace. But how was I supposed to give it to him? How could I set right something that had been buried for so long? The fog clung to the streets as I made my way back toward the village center. I knew I needed to speak to Father O'Malley. If anyone had answers about how to deal with a restless spirit, it would be him. And if he didn't, then I didn't know what I would do. The church sat on a small hill at the edge of the village, its steeple rising out of the mist like a lone sentinel. The heavy wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty chapel. Father O'Malley was kneeling at the altar, his head bowed in prayer. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to disturb him, but then the weight of the situation pushed me forward. "Father," I said quietly. He looked up, startled by my presence, and then slowly rose to his feet. "Aiden," he said, his voice steady but concerned. "I didn't expect to see you here. Is something troubling you?" I nodded, not sure where to begin. "It's about Kieran," I said. "His spirit, it's still here." Father O'Malley's expression darkened. He motioned for me to sit in one of the pews, and then he took a seat beside me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence in the church was thick, almost oppressive, as if the weight of unspoken confessions hung in the air. "I know," he said finally, his voice low. "I've known for a long time." I turned to him, surprised. "Then why didn't you say anything? Why did you let this go on?" Father O'Malley sighed deeply, rubbing his hands over his face. "It's not that simple, Aiden. There are things in this world that we don't fully understand. The dead don't always rest easy, especially when their deaths were not natural. I knew Kieran's spirit lingered, but I didn't know how to set him free. I hoped that with time, he would find peace on his own. But he hasn't," I said, my voice hard. "He's still trapped, and it's because of what happened that night, because of what my father did." Father O'Malley nodded slowly. "Yes, your father made a mistake, one he regretted for the rest of his life. But that mistake has bound Kieran to this place. His spirit cannot move on until the truth is brought to light." I clenched my fists, frustration bubbling up inside me. How do I set him free? What am I supposed to do? Father O'Malley looked at me with a solemn expression. "There's a ritual. It's an old tradition, passed down through generations. It's not something we often speak of, but in cases like this, it's our only option." "What kind of ritual?" I asked, a mixture of curiosity and fear swirling in my chest. "The ritual involves acknowledging the wrong that was done," Father O'Malley explained. "You must speak the truth aloud at the place where Kieran died, at the cliffs. You must tell his story, make it known, and ask for his forgiveness. Only then can his spirit be released." I felt a chill run down my spine at the thought of standing on those cliffs, speaking to a man long dead, trying to right a wrong that had festered for years. But what choice did I have? If I didn't do this, Kieran's spirit would continue to haunt me and the town indefinitely. And what if it doesn't work? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Father O'Malley placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You have to believe that it will, Aiden. You have to trust that by doing this, you are giving Kieran what he's been waiting for all these years, acknowledgement. Sometimes that's all the dead need, to know that their suffering hasn't been forgotten." I swallowed hard, trying to calm the anxiety rising within me. This was more than just a ritual. It was a confrontation with the past, a reckoning with the choices my father had made and the consequences that followed. When should I do it? I asked. Tonight, Father O'Malley said, his voice steady. Go to the cliffs at midnight. The sea will be calm then, and the veil between the living and the dead will be thinnest. That is when you will have the best chance of reaching him. I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Tonight? It had to be tonight. There was no turning back now. The weight of the past rested on my shoulders, and I would face it head-on, no matter what awaited me on those cliffs. The days that followed the ritual felt lighter, as though the entire town had breathed a collective sigh of relief. The fog, which had once clung to the cliffs and streets like a second skin, now came and went with the tides, no longer as oppressive as before. The constant weight I had carried since returning had begun to lift, replaced with a calm that was almost foreign to me. Yet, as I walked through the village, past the familiar cottages and the narrow, cobbled streets, there was a sense of finality in the air. The town, though quieter, seemed unchanged by what had happened. The people still went about their lives, tending to their daily routines, though they cast fewer suspicious glances in my direction. It was as if the dark cloud that had hung over the place for years had finally dissipated, but no one wanted to acknowledge it aloud. I found myself standing at the cliffs again one last time, watching the sea roll in and out with a steady rhythm. The place where I had stood to confront Kieran's spirit no longer felt haunted, but rather peaceful, almost sacred. The ritual had worked. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the wind seemed softer, the air clearer. But the emptiness I had felt after Kieran's release still lingered. It was a quiet, gnawing sensation that reminded me of everything that had been lost, the years away from my family, the death of my wife, the knowledge that no amount of ritual could truly erase the past. I had done what needed to be done, but it hadn't changed the truth of what my father had done, nor had it erased the scars left behind. I walked back to the house, knowing that it, too, was no longer the same. The old family home, with its peeling walls and sagging roof, had been filled with so many memories, some good, but many burdened with the weight of secrets. Now, those secrets were no longer hidden, and though the air inside felt lighter, the house no longer felt like home. Maeve came by the next morning, just as I was packing the last of my things. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me with an expression that was difficult to read. There was relief in her eyes, but also a sadness that mirrored my own. We hadn't spoken much since the night of the ritual, both of us still processing the weight of what had been uncovered. "Are you leaving, then?" she asked quietly, stepping inside. I nodded, closing the last suitcase and setting it by the door. "I think it's time," I said. "There's nothing left for me here." Maeve looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the old family photos that still hung on the walls. "It feels different now," she said, her voice soft. "Like a chapter has ended." "It has," I agreed, though the words felt bittersweet. "I'm glad we did what we did, Maeve. But I can't stay here. Not anymore." She nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. We had done what needed to be done for Kieran, but in doing so, we had opened wounds that would take time to heal, if they ever did. The town may have moved on, but I wasn't sure if I ever truly would. As I stood by the door, ready to leave, Maeve reached out and placed a hand on my arm. "Take care of yourself, Aiden," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Wherever you go, just take care." I smiled faintly, though the emotion didn't quite reach my eyes. "You too, Maeve." And with that, I left the house behind, stepping out into the cool morning air. The town was quiet as I walked toward the station, the sound of the sea ever present in the background. I felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy, relief that Kieran had found peace, but melancholy for everything that had been lost in the process. The train station sat at the edge of the village, a small, weathered building that hadn't changed much since I'd left years ago. I bought my ticket and sat on a bench, waiting for the next train out. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and distant rain, and I watched as the gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and piercing. As the train pulled into the station, I stood, clutching my suitcase a little tighter. This was it, the end of this chapter, the closing of a door that I wasn't sure I'd ever reopen. I boarded the train, finding a seat by the window, and as the train began to move, I watched the village fade into the distance, the cliffs and sea disappearing into the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of quiet inside myself. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was something close. The emptiness was still there, but now there was space for something new to grow in its place. As the train carried me away from the village, I knew I would never forget what had happened there. Kieran's story would stay with me, just as the sea stayed with the cliffs, ever constant, ever shifting. But for now, it was time to move forward, wherever that might lead. It had been several weeks since I left the village behind. The days passed in a blur as I settled into a small flat in the city. Life moved differently here, faster, louder, more disconnected. The distant sound of the sea was replaced by the hum of traffic, the cries of gulls by the chatter of city streets. It was a world away from the cliffs and fog that had haunted my thoughts for so long. For the most part, I had managed to push it all from my mind. Kieran, my father, the ritual. They felt like fragments of another life, memories that had faded into the background as I tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. But every now and then, the past would surface, tugging at the edges of my thoughts like the relentless pull of the tide. It was on one such day, when I had almost convinced myself that I had left the haunting behind for good, that a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the paper thin and yellowed with age. My name was written in a neat hand across the front, but there was no return address, no indication of who had sent it or where it had come from. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, feeling a familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine. The letter was brief, the words carefully penned in elegant script. Aidan Callahan, I have heard of what you did in your village. There's a place not far from here, another coastal village, where the dead do not rest. We need your help. There was no signature, just a name. Kilgannon. I stared at the name for a long time, feeling the old weight settle back over my shoulders. I had thought my dealings with the dead were over, but it seemed they were only just beginning. If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.